Welcome to Beyond the FAR from GW Law's Government Procurement Law program, where experts unpack the business of government. From Washington and beyond, we explore procurement at the intersection of law, policy, and practice, shaping markets, driving innovation, and impacting lives across the globe. And now, here's your host, Dean Jessica Tillipman.
Welcome back to Beyond the FAR. I am Jessica Tillipman, the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies at GW Law School, and your host for today. All right, we have some special guests for you. We have three of them, but just to lay the foundation before we enter the conversation, let's get started. Goods and services don't just buy themselves. Rules don't award contracts. People do. And every few years, the government seems to forget that, not just the United States, but globally. We launch rounds of reform. We promise faster, smarter acquisition, but we always forget the hardest part, the people actually doing the work. We've cut the workforce before, most notably in the 90s. We've lost expertise, institutional knowledge, and we spent decades trying to rebuild it, yet here we are doing it all over again. A lot of this happens because people often treat procurement like a back office task. It's not. It's how the government turns policy into action. And when we treat government procurement like order fulfillment rather than critical infrastructure, we weaken everything that we do as a government, from readiness to innovation. All right, so this is where my guests are coming in. They're joining us today in their personal capacities, and all three of them are invested in making sure that reform actually reaches the people who have to deliver it. Okay, so first up, we have Bonnie Evangelista, who brings more than 15 years of acquisition experience in government. She's known for pushing boundaries and how federal buying gets done, and now serves as a senior strategic advisor on the GSA team driving the Revolutionary FAR Overhaul. We are also joined by my GW Law colleague and my predecessor at GW Law School, Karen Thornton, who began her career as an Army JAG and is part of the team that is established the congressionally mandated Defense Civilian Training Corps, known as DCTC. You will hear a lot about it today. A talent development program that prepares public service-minded college students for the defense acquisition workforce. And then last but certainly not least, John Willison, who co-founded DCTC after a 36-year career as an Army civilian in program management. In his last role as deputy to the commanding general at DevCom, he led the Future of Work initiative for a 15,000-person workforce. Okay, with that out of the way, and again, in their personal capacities, let's get started with a kind of high-level table setting question. All right, we've been talking about reform for pretty much ever when it comes to government procurement. Now here we are once again with the Revolutionary FAR Overhaul, among many other reforms that are happening in the procurement space. New rules, new systems, new acronyms, but somehow the people, the acquisition workforce, always gets left behind. Why is it so hard for governments, and not just the United States government, but governments, to treat its acquisition workforce like strategic infrastructure instead of an afterthought? All right, Karen, I'm starting with you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you, and thank you for bringing together these wonderful colleagues. This is very hard, and honestly, if we try to rely on the training that got us here, all of these current efforts in policy change and dismantling and overhauling, they're just not going to stick. The hard part here is that there are real skills that need to be developed in the workforce, and I'm not even sure most agencies know how to articulate them. For too long, we've hired based on vacancies and the career fields within the acquisition workforce without really asking ourselves, what are the skills that we need practitioners to demonstrate, and how do you develop those skills? I honestly didn't learn how hard this is until I became a teacher, until I joined the faculty at GW Law School, and it was my responsibility to take first-year law students and teach them how to think analytically, to communicate in writing and orally, to demonstrate how they used their judgment and how to, reason. And I know this is difficult because it takes practice, it takes resilience. We have to have the kind of opportunities for development where our practitioners get feedback, where they learn how to overcome the uncomfortable feelings that accompany feedback. And I really think that means that we're looking at education for our workforce, not just training. And I'll keep coming back to this. I want to turn it over to my colleagues. But what I experienced firsthand as a student at GW, and then in the classroom as a coach, facilitator, teacher, is that it's in the academic environment that we can really test ideas and engage in multidisciplinary kinds of conversation and questioning. And that's just really not being done in training currently. So we've got to do the hard work to develop, to identify these skills and do the work to develop them for the workforce.
Thanks,
I'll
Karen.
jump in.
Oh, go ahead, Bonnie.
I'll jump in just to riff off of something that Karen said about how we hire people and how there might be a direct correlation to competency, because most agencies start acquisition professionals, I'll say young, I'm using air quotes, and for those who might just be listening, but there's only a few pathways to become a member of the acquisition workforce. And if you don't get in early, you may never get in. So you might have a career in business and may not be able to switch careers to become part of the acquisition workforce and use your brilliant business acumen or expertise that you've accumulated in industry. There's an expectation that you have to be junior in the sense like college graduate. So after you attained a certain level of education with some credits in business, you might be transferable. And sorry, I'm speaking from more from the procurement function, but there's multiple functions in acquisition. But whatever your function is, you start young, and there is a step ladder to growing in the acquisition workforce. And everyone assumes that that's the path. So to Karen's point, maybe there shouldn't be just one path. There needs to be multiple pathways to bring in lots of different types of expertise and skill sets to the table. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing like the system is, I don't know if choked is the right word, but we're coming to a breaking point where it's just not going to work if we keep compounding the issues and no one's addressing the fundamental thing that's happening with people.
John, let me ask you to follow up that. So we were hearing about the difference between what we sometimes refer to as retail training and education. Bonnie's now raised the pipelines, but I mean, to get back to the original question, which is why are we always so focused on the rules and reforms and not the people themselves?
That's a great question, and thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, to your initial point, right? We love talking about policy, we love talking about reform, we love talking about technology, we love talking about all these things that are couched as the end product. But in the end, it's a people business. But the people aren't the end product. And so if you really want to take a people perspective, you've got to be able to first look longer term than just immediate fix. Because as Bonnie correctly pointed out, the way most people manage talent is just reactively filling a vacancy. Someone leaves, I'm going to hire someone that was just like them. Right? And that's not adequate if you're talking about reform, if you're trying to talk about making changes. The other part I would add is one of the other things that makes this hard is, unlike some of the other things we've talked about, the people part is harder to manage. So how do you I should say the people part is harder to measure and therefore harder to manage. So how do you measure the health of your talent? Right? We can manage how many things we get on contract. We can manage how many things are fielded. We can manage how much new technology is getting in. How do you measure the health of your talent? And so I think an additional look at how to measure it, and then a more strategic, longer term vision about if I make an investment, I'll get a return, would add a new perspective or different perspective. Now that adds also some challenges, right? So if it's we need to reform and we need to reform now, and there's an urgency, then it is harder to focus on the people aspect, but it's an oversight because that is the enabler, and that in the end is what's going to make the difference.
That's what I was going to contribute as well, is that it's harder. It's not sexy to do the long-term thing. Leaders want to come in, have immediate impact, and they want to drive change, so they say. And it's harder to convince people around you that what John is saying is actually better for the organization, because they're not going to be able to measure or see anything in the next 1 to 2 years, and then maybe their time's up.
Well, I think that gets to a bigger part, which is when we're talking about reform in and of itself, we think about the RFO, and there's been so much focus. And I'd consider it like the underpinning of the entire RFO is not just taking the rules and paring them back from their, from what's kind of bloomed into the FAR as we know it, the Federal Acquisition Regulation as we know it, but the paring it back to its statutory minimums. But more importantly, the big theme that I hear from everyone speaking about it is, giving discretion back to the contracting officers, making this highly discretionary, letting them use their, I hear this words a lot, sound business judgment, giving them, broad latitude to exercise this business judgment, to use their critical thinking skills, and again, giving them that discretion. Yet when I hear you talking about it, you're talking about these bigger skill sets. And this gets back to Karen talking about the difference between training and education, where you've got training that's kind of check the box, here's what you do, versus education, which is why you do it, and adaptive judgment and critical thinking. I mean, to me, it feels like we have the messaging, right? Versus, and by the way, I'll let Bonnie not speak to that yet since she's been working on it, but I'm sure she has thoughts. Karen, talk to us about that difference when you hear policymakers talk about business judgment and critical thinking, yet the only thing we've ever invested in is retail training and amidst workforce cuts.
Yeah, so I am perhaps the biggest cheerleader for the GW law program, second only to Steve Schooner. But when I was an LLM candidate, it was the FAR 15 rewrite had just come out. And I wrote my thesis about how this is great. And the concept of delegation and empowerment is exactly where we need to be. However, if you don't provide guidance in the form of positive best practices, examples, then you won't be able to have the kind of confidence that the workforce needs in an environment that is typically very top down and directive. And now that Bonnie's working on the overhaul, I'd love for you to hear from her about how this time around is going to be different, because in a culture that is so compliance focused, when you say to someone, oh, no, really, we want to see you apply the judgment, but we're not telling you, or we're not preparing you necessarily with the skills that need to be practiced and developed like muscles, including resilience, including the knowing when and how to press back and ask, well, just because we've done it this way before, what is it? What would it be to experiment here? And will you give me the top cover that I need to experiment here? Because that's what my judgment is telling me we need to do. Now you want to hear from Bonnie about this.
I'm with Jessica in terms of you hear a lot of the same phrases, talking points, messages everywhere across government. We want better outcomes from acquisitions. We want faster. We want more innovative. We want the best acquisition workforce to deliver all these things. And I get very disenchanted very quickly because the excitement that you get when you hear these words or you see them in the executive orders. If you actually read some of the executive orders that Jessica is probably going to link to this episode, they're not all wrong. Like it's interesting to be in a time where you have the utmost top cover you could have, like from the White House saying this has to get better. And then as that gets distilled from layer to layer to layer, how it's interpreted, and as Karen's pointing out, as it's applied, it's still very different. And I think a little bit of that is even a lot of the team members, they want the empowerment, they want to drive the change, and they want to set the table. They want that table setting to let the doers go do. I was one of the most critical advocates on the team to talk about when, I think, Jessica, you were quoting Vern Edwards in your opening, people write contracts, not policy, not regulations. And I think even in your paper over the summer, you quoted him and he said, people start revolutions, not policy. So it's wonderful to have the policy support. A lot of people would argue the things that are now being written down on paper could have happened in the old system or regime and whatnot. And now I do love the fact that the more we can encourage on paper, this is what you can do. And this is what anything to inspire the practitioner, that's great, but it's not enough. And I know that's been the theme of the conversation today. So how do you develop people who can discern when they're not getting a good business deal? And there's a lot of soft skilling, like Karen was talking about. You have to have resilience. You might be a naysayer at the table, and it's hard to be a naysayer in a compliance oriented, especially in a Department of War culture where it's very command and control. Even in a civilian setting, like there's this very, like, you have to follow chain of command type of culture and stuff. So I think John can speak to this as well, where it's very hard to be the outlier. Like that's not culturally approved and accepted. So there's a little bit of risk taking on the practitioner to develop these skills in the current setting. And even with the policy changes now, there's still that, I would argue that same risk is still there, even though you've got people at the top saying, yes, do more, you can be innovative, you can go faster, like you can use your sound business judgment. A lot of times when I try to teach other practitioners, like, you just have to be able to defend your decisions. If you're willing to defend any of your decisions, like, you're good. And that's I would say ownership versus accountability. Like, if you're willing to own the decision and the outcome, like, you're good, because that likely means you're not going to stray too far from whatever the black and white policy says, and you're not going to put yourself in a too terrible legal risk or something like that. So I guess what I would offer all that to say is it's wonderful to have policy updates, but I'm with where we started. Like, where's the focus on the workforce? There's still this air of the workforce will just figure it out, and there's not enough. I don't know if I think. Institutional support. I think, Jessica, you talked about that in your paper with Steve Schooner as well. Like, it's not just education and resources, like there has to be institutional support as well.
Yeah. And
I think John would offer some insight to that as well, coming from the Army.
Yeah, and John, I would love to hear that. And I also, if you could maybe take this additional thread that Bonnie mentioned, and this is something, Karen, you and I have talked about as well, which is part of the reason we see so much success. And again, this is not just a pitch our program, there are other MSL programs like this, but that one of the skill sets is teaching people how to write and think and analyze like a lawyer, so that they're better able to justify it to the lawyers when they want to try something that's going to be a little bit different. And I'm not sure that what we've done by, and this is use the quotes, eliminating the musts and shalls, is enough. So John, I'd love to hear in your experience what you think a significant policy overhaul like this is going to do to the acquisition workforce, and whether this is something we need, or how can we achieve what people say that they want out of this overhaul effort?
No, great. So I'd offer a couple things. So first, I think the system, whatever the system is, Department of War acquisition, whatever, is filled with a lot of good people who are mostly doing exactly what they've been asked to do. And so some of this is, are we asking them to do something different? Are we asking them to do things differently and be clear on that? And if you've been working with the government, in the government long enough, you know this comes in 10-year cycles, right? We'll swing to one extreme, which is we need a lot of rules, a lot of bad things have happened. Any government rule exists because someone did something and someone wrote a rule trying to make sure that never happened again, right? So we'll go very rule burdened, very top down, risk adverse, compliance based, and then we'll get to a point like we are now saying this isn't working. And the tendency is to try to swing it to the other extreme. Let's take down all the rules. Let's have very limited rules, and we'll rely completely on people interpreting intent and swing it to the other extreme. The best would be to fall somewhere in between there. So you do have some guidance, some education that's based on institutional knowledge, based on experience, nudging people in the right direction, but also gives them the ability to tailor to their unique situation and supports them in doing that, right? And that we hold up role models when things work or role models when things don't work. And we hold that up as something to learn from, something to build from, and something to move forward with. And so, yeah, to me, there's a balance here between not just burning the village down and saying, okay, let's go again. But how do you leverage all the experience to fix the problems that are fixed, but then also empower people to do good things based on their understanding of the intent and based on whatever experience and education that we give them to fill the gaps in for that experience.
I'll give an example from an RFO perspective of what I think John is talking about. We're going to go through a ton of effort to remove all the shalls, like you were saying, Jessica, from the FAR. The number one concern that I heard from people across the government was, what if the agency just creates a bunch of local policy or guidance that kind of reverts the goodness or the progress of the FAR? And of course, nobody hopes that happens, but like that's, I think they're just expressing what they believe the reality will be. Well, that you're going to remove all this, and there's going to be some institutional inertia that's going to push back and still make it hard to get to yes or whatever your situation might be. To use discernment, to use your judgment, whatever. So there's still going to be a level of resiliency paired with education that has to happen. I think we've been pulling that thread a little bit. And I'll also offer, I forget the term, like experiential learning to some degree. Like we have to be in settings that push us. And if we're not, I think this is where complacency, and when we ask the question of workforce capacity, our capacity is only what, as John said, what we've been told to do. And we have to be in settings that maybe take us to an edge we've never been before. And that is really hard to do and to manage, and to trust a group of people to try something new, I suppose, and see what happens, even if it doesn't maybe work out in your favor.
I wanted to turn to Karen. I was going to actually say, Karen, I wanted to turn to you on this one with what she said, and then maybe you can answer that and respond. But I think as someone who's taught this, one of the things that I think is the most challenging is that I think agencies will naturally want to default to internal rule systems, because you basically have an acquisition workforce who today is getting deviations that are being told to implement them today without the infrastructure in place to try to empower them to use that business judgment and critical thinking. And they will be looking around wondering what to do because they don't want to be protested. Yeah. And the lawyers that are advising them don't want them to be protested, even though we all know that statistically the rates are actually much lower. And I could go into a whole separate podcast just about that. Yeah. but I mean, I guess this gets back to Karen and your goals in terms of educating the next generation of acquisition professionals, or even, frankly, the current generation of acquisition professionals who've just been given a new set of rules. They've taken off the bumpers and they're saying, use all your big thinking skills and be innovative and go.
So, like so many people, the biggest, my biggest passions and like things that I want to be part of change come from lessons I learned the hard way earlier in my own career. And when I was a young JAG, I was stationed at the headquarters of the Army Corps of Engineers in the Chief Counsel's office, and it would have been my job to take this new FAR overhaul and decide what needed to show up in the engineer FAR supplement, which is 2 layers down, right? The FAR, the DFARs, the engineer FAR supplement. And that was a terrifying amount of responsibility for somebody straight out of law school. And the only thing I knew from law school was about reading rules and applying them to factual situations. And had it not been for the chief counsel, Lester Edelman, who said, we get to yes on behalf of our clients. That is our job as lawyers. And I was like, I'm sorry, I did not learn that in law school. What are you talking about? I learned to read rules and mostly say no based on rules. So it's this combination of not just education, but also coaching and mentoring that people need in their professional lives. And so that's what we have built into the Defense Civilian Training Corps curriculum. Because, of course, at night, when I was that young JAG, I was going to GW for the LLM program, right? And I was then in the kind of classroom that was helping me understand how to get to yes on behalf of the client, because that was what the way the government contracts curriculum was established. So everything basically that I learned in those first 4 years of my career, I want to shift left so that these folks who are demonstrating a desire to serve learn it much earlier. Because so often my classmates and I were realizing, I wish I knew this so much earlier in my life, in my professional development. I wish I learned what it meant to be a collaborative team member. I wish I learned what it meant to like really listen and understand the fact pattern before I jump to, oh, well, that's a FAR Part 12 problem, right? To anticipate the problem or the answer to the problem without really understanding what the problem is. So that's the way we have developed the curriculum. We've gone to, when Congress directed DOD to establish this program, it said there were critical skill gaps that the DOD needs to have filled, and we need it to be done on the academic campuses, and we're going to call it DCTC. That happened in the FY20 NDAA, and we launched in 2023. It turns out over the past 2 years of being experimental, we've realized that problem that Congress identified isn't really the problem, right? That's what you learn when you experiment. It's not like the pathway is really hard, not for a lot of reasons, just like because there aren't any billets at the time when you need them. But also really the hardest part is those critical skills haven't been defined. And so we did some work from an academic perspective to identify what it means to have, like, what these, some people call them soft skills, some people call them employability skills, the ability to communicate, the ability to collaborate on a team, the ability to be a systems thinker and do critical thinking, and then also learning how to do that within the DoD space. Because when you're talking to college students, they don't understand how, first of all, the three branches of government work, and then more specifically in DoD. But working on those skills, and then also having a coach or mentor, someone with the experience to help the students see how things things happen in real life, like where the tensions really are within an organization, is something that I think personally is really novel. And it's one of the things that is the most dangerous about the way we are going to now be facing a smaller workforce, many of whom have taken early retirement, and they're going to be leaving that gap of the coach role to support, buttress, and reinforce the learning. And John has a lot to say on this. I'd love you to hear his perspective too.
No, thanks, Karen. Appreciate that. I can go back a little bit and just talk to something if you think about the Army, that's where most of my experience is, right? In the Army does two basic things. It's a warfighting machine and it's a business. And all the FAR overhaul and all, it's really talking to how to improve the business side. And there's some lessons that can be learned from the warfighting side, right? Specifically, it's about 20 years ago or so, General Dempsey led the Army through a change of doctrine from command and control, hierarchical, very hierarchical. Our commander gives orders and people were expected to follow those specific orders. To a doctrine of mission command, which is more, commander gives a broad intent and then empowers people to exercise discipline, initiative within that intent based on trust. Right? And so that's the Army's doctrine under mission command. Turns out it's a pretty good leadership philosophy on the business side as well. So how do you give broad intent and how do you allow for discipline, initiative based on trust within that intent? And that is a culture change from where we've been. Right? And it's not an easy culture change. But if you think again back to the warfighting side, the way they do that is through training. And I'm going to use that term loosely, not in the same context as training versus education, because it's really education they're getting. By running exercises, by running drills, by running war games, and showing what's possible and throwing different dilemmas, throwing different problems at, and let people form as a team and let them build that muscle memory of solving hard problems based on their own initiative, as opposed to trying to prescribe a solution for every instance, right? Because everything's different locally and everything moves too fast, and that's true on both sides, right? And so I love the one General McQuistel quote where he talks about, what he would tell his soldiers to do is execute the order I should have given you, right? And that'd be an interesting way to look at the FAR, right? Execute the FAR that I should have told you to execute. But you got to then develop those behavior patterns, and you've got to reinforce those behavior patterns by those that are executing, so they know it's okay, and they have the tools to do that. And that's a combination of competence. Do I know the rules? Do I know my subject matter experts? But it's also just equally a matter of character. And so how are we recruiting people for both competence and character? How are we developing and educating people both competence and character? And in the end, the character part's going to shine through because the competence changes, the rules change every day, the technology changes every day. And you're going to end up relying on the character, the people that understand what it means to take initiative, the people that understand what it means to work as part of a team. Right? And to Karen's point, that's part of what we're trying to instill in these junior folks that are coming in to the government. But frankly, that's an education needed at all levels.
And what Karen was talking about with having some kind of coaching or mentoring part, I'm not talking about formal mentorship programs that happen in almost every organization. I'm not talking about that. But having a trusted person with a little bit of experience to help make, shape or guide how you're thinking about a situation is really important. And what she described, I was actually really impressed, Karen. I would love to have had the attorney you were just talking about. I had someone like that in my career really early on, Ron Gallahue, and he basically helped me stop playing the victim in my function. And it was everybody else's fault. That's kind of what we were taught. Like, if we don't get a perfect package, that's not your fault, that's their fault. If you don't get the information or like all the things you need to do your job, it's not your fault, and it's someone else, it's some other function's fault. And he helped me understand also like how to have a customer service oriented mindset He's like, the reality of the situation is your customer is going through X, Y, and Z, and you're not going to get all the information you think you need or that you were taught to need to do your job. So how do we help them? How do you get to yes, or how do you find goodness despite your circumstances, which will never be perfect? And that was the early thing that I learned was like, you're never going to be in perfect conditions, no matter where you are. It's just never going to be that way. But if you don't know that going into it, like, it's everything John and Karen are talking about. Like, you just have somebody who's like fumbling or throwing spaghetti at the wall, when you can have a very intentional effort to growing and fostering culture and people in the way that will get the actions and behaviors that you want.
I want to follow up and pulling that thread a little bit more, because everything that you're saying sounds wonderful, but the common theme across everything has been so far that you've had individuals that have seen kind of the way forward. This is how you do. You've demonstrated leadership. You've had some sort of, even if it's just an individual, it's a mentor demonstrating kind of these bigger thinking than you would normally have somebody that just says, like, here's the list of things that you need to do to buy something. Go ahead and just buy something. And I guess I need to look at that and put it back into context. So we are recording this in the middle of a government shutdown, an exceedingly long government shutdown. By the way, as I launch into this, I want to also remind everybody again that they are speaking in their personal capacities. A very, very long government shutdown, coming off of a period in which we've seen significant reductions in force. We're still seeing threats to reduce force within both civilian and then obviously in the defense side of the government. And so to me, when I look at this, because when I look at the way that we have to think about this, it's comprehensive. It's not just training, it's education. It's not just building a sustainable pipeline, it's retention. It's not just, having a good mentor, it's community building through organizations. And really, it's much bigger piece, and there's every piece needs to come to play. But I see all these wonderful thoughts from innovators like you guys, but it's against a backdrop in which you've had people being kind of either forced out or encouraged to leave government. And you've got to, I think we can say this, it's like, it's not functional when we're shut down in the way that we are. And how is government to be attractive enough to people to want to enter it, to have those innovative people, those people that see government as a true growth opportunity, that want to be public service minded in an environment that is, and I'll say it because you won't, and I'm not blaming this on the thing, a toxic environment. So, how do we do this? And I ask who wants to take this, because, and I'm not saying that you're saying it's toxic, I think it's toxic. So who wants to, because I think John does. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'll jump on this. Just from an interesting data point, right? So as Karen referenced, one of the things that she and I both work on is this thing called DCTC, which is developing college students to come in and be DoD civilians, specifically in the acquisition workforce. And it's been going on for about 2.5 years now. And with everything going on, we see no lack of interest still in coming to work for DoD. It may surprise people, right? Because you're like, some people would be like, oh, geez, that's crazy. Who wants to go work there? So I guess from a factual point of view, I can tell you a data point, we see no less interest in going to work for DoD, all things considered. Part of that, I think, is people love being part of something that's solving hard problems, right? Department of War absolutely has some of the hardest problems to solve. So if you're attracted to solving hard problems, and there is an aspect of service to this, right? They love to be part of something, contributing something bigger than themselves, right? So in some respects, yeah, you can look at it as, man, that's a huge challenge. I think, fortunately, we have enough people who see it as a huge opportunity. If you want to be part of something different, if you want to be part of something really hard, sounds to me like that's Department of War, and that's Department of War acquisition right now. So, yeah, again, I think part of what's going on is just we go through these cycles. Do we have too many people? Do we not have enough people? Do we have the right kind of people? Do we need more people? Businesses go through this cycle, and so when the government goes through it, it's a little bit more visible and a little bit more obvious. But I do think there's a larger question for the Department of War for folks, and that is just what is the approach it takes to managing, in this case, civilian talent. Right? I would be, and not a lot of people love this, but I would be an advocate for more use of term positions. 3 to 5 year term positions, renewable, right? Because it's not the Supreme Court when you go into work for the Department of War as a civilian. It's not supposed to be a lifetime appointment. There's a premise there that you maintain a competency, you maintain a motivation, you're the right person at that time as problems change, right? And so how do we refresh talent? Both people that are still there that will need to learn and then unlearn some things and relearn some other things, and how do you motivate that? And when do you bring new talent in that just has a fresh perspective and a fresh look? And there should be a health in the system when there's movement. People moving side to side, people moving into the government, out of the government, back into the government, people moving up and down. And so I think there's some motivation to try to make that happen. You could argue whether the approaches are the right approaches or not, but I think fundamentally, I think some of the emphasis on taking a look at, do we have the right talent, taking a look at what it means to keep the right talent, to refresh the right talent, to understand the Department of War side, to understand the business side, back and forth, is a debate worth having. But I'll come back to where I started, which is the good news is we're not seeing any less interest in coming to work for the Department of War.
I would like to pull, I loved everything John said, and I want to pull on the mission thread, because in my experience as a practitioner, that's what I've seen as well. I don't have the data points to back it up like he does, but I've seen what trumps everything is mission, even from on the business side of the house. Even if you're not a soldier or warfighter, you'll see people go through, be resilient in all kinds of not ideal conditions just because they care about the mission. So to me, the biggest cultural one shakeup, because it may not be a shakeup for some people, but like if you don't get this right culturally, then people will leave because they don't feel like they can do, like they have something to offer in the environment or to the mission. So one, you have to deeply connect them to the mission. How do you do that? Well, maybe you should send your acquisition professionals to the place that they are impacting, because in my experience, the acquisition professional is actually not connected to the end user or what they're actually supporting. I'm speaking in generally. I understand there are pockets of people who do this really well, but that is one of the great disconnects that leads to what a lot of people call the valley of death. And because of that, we have the buying community, the acquisition professionals, and then the end user community, which are the people who will actually make industry's product better. But then the buying community has all the money, and they don't really seamlessly talk to each other. So that's like one of the cultural things. But that aside, when you get the acquisition professional caring more than themselves into what they are supporting, that's where I've seen magic happen, including some of the things I've worked on in the past, such as trade winds. And then thing two, I think one of the cultural upsets that needs to happen that supports this whole mission alignment is you need people who are inspired. So they might be inspired by mission, or they might be inspired, like John said, about solving hard problems. But you don't get that inspiration in the top-down culture that Karen talked about. If leadership is always telling you what to do, that's not inspiring. You need a culture where there's more bottoms up, whether you call it innovation or new ideation. We have to convert from the culture of, if I am thinking in my seat as the practitioner, what do I need to do to get my leadership to say yes? That's not good. If you're in the seat, this is what I think the RFO is trying to do, where when they talk about empowerment, how can you decide what the best business deal or the best business decision in, and then get leadership buy-in and whatnot. So when you're inspired to have some ownership in the outcome like that, that's where I think we get to places where people are so connected to either their service or to solving the hard problem, like they kind of forget the noise around them, no matter how bad it is. Like you're describing, it could get really bad, but people will be resilient because they care more about doing something good or moving the needle in the right direction.
One thing I want to focus on is a lot of everything that you've said has been really interesting. And obviously, if we could just basically make a bunch of you and then spread you out throughout the government, that would be great. You would be our institutional change makers and mentors everywhere. But this is very much a defense-oriented conversation. And yet, when I look at things from like a civilian perspective, where we also do a significant amount of buying, and increasingly, we're going to see a lot of it consolidated under GSA. That's going to have a very different dynamic. And I want to actually bring this in. I don't want to derail this in terms of artificial intelligence, although I am biased because that's where most of my research and focus is lately. But as much as we talk about the lack of almost kind of like acquisition literacy or fluency or experience on the acquisition side, the AI literacy is increasingly a problem, and the two are coming together in a very fast way. And in my research, what I have found is that a lot of the things that I think could be achievable in terms of governance from like a technology standpoint in DoD, because you have kind of the investment in some educated folks that are doing this. You have things like trade winds. You've had some experimentation. A lot of that to me is absent on the civilian side. And I worry a little bit about how much investment we have here, but there also seems to be, to me, a gap between the two sides. And I guess my question then gets back to Karen, which is, could we see a DCTC that's kind of government-wide instead of defense civilian training courts? There's just like a government civilian training, although we've talked about renaming it to government civilian education corps instead of just training. But could we see that spreading?
I mean, absolutely. There's no question what we're experimenting with in DoD can be scaled and applied across government. I think that the point John made about learn, unlearn, relearn, and about term appointments, what we really, again, what's the problem we're trying to solve? I think there's a real mobility problem that could help solve a lot of this. Like, to not just think of this as a, like you said, agency specific issue or an agency specific culture, but instead to have the kind of career pathway for the civilian workforce, the way that the department, is so effective with folks in uniform. There's central management of their development from one assignment to the next. We have no such thing for the civilian workforce. And in fact, there's lots of obstacles in the way. Like, a manager has to make a very difficult decision when they approve someone to leave and go for a talent exchange program assignment, or when they leave and go for an extended education assignment. What am I going to do with them when they get back? How am I going to make sure that they apply their skills, their newfound skills? How am I going to, make up for them while they're gone? Well, if we can have more courageous leadership that recognizes that this kind of investment improves the ecosystem, and that we need to be collaborating with industry on these kinds of partnerships. We need to be collaborating intergovernmentally so that the flow of the workforce back and forth across these kinds of assignments and roles through whether it's term appointments or, whatever because John knows all the how to hire people and how to do the talent management from his leadership experience. But that is how you're going to really get people to have the sense that they are being invested in and that they can grow with each assignment and put together their own pathway in a way that's not going to be done centrally for them.
Jessica, to your point about government versus Department of War. So the program Karen referenced before that we've been working, we've identified 5 critical skill areas. I would argue 4 of the 5 are directly related to any part, right? So there's one part about optimizing your performance as an individual, knowing yourself, resilience, etc. Another part is about working as part of a team. Third part is solving complex problems. The fourth part, also to your reference, is about digital transformation and AI. How do I apply it in my space? And then the fifth part in our case is about the defense acquisition system. Right? Well, 4 of those 5 apply equally to other parts of the government or other parts of other organizations. And so I think that's important from a portability of skills that Karen referenced. You want to see some movement. And a lot of the problem we're addressing is shared by a lot of other people as well.
What's interesting about that question in particular is I think we're a lot closer than we think we are, but it's really hard in the government to look holistically. So I remember when I first met Karen and was told about what DCTC was, I said, Karen, I'm the poster child of this program because the Department of Homeland Security has a very similar program. They just didn't do scholarships in college. But the DHS has something called the Acquisition Professional Career Program, APCP. So I didn't start my career in the Department of War. I was actually, I was with DHS for, like 13 or 14 years. And it was through that program. But I didn't get it, but I didn't get the coaching that DCTC gets. I didn't get the resources as a college student that they are getting financially or education-wise. But it was a very similar pipeline where there was a leader who I think was trying to think strategically, like John was talking about earlier, like long term. They're like, everyone, this was in 2008-ish era, everyone's retiring in the next 5 to 15 years. We need a pipeline of acquisition professionals. So they started as a small pilot. I was in the second cohort, and I was recruited out of college. And it was a very fast-track program, get you credentialed and trained as fast as possible, and then you have some experiences across DHS components for the first 3 years before you're placed. And it's interesting, where I think actually DHS does a little bit better than DCTC is the placement. They had a place for us. They made organizations make sure there were future year billets if we were to go to their component as the intern. So DHS headquarters would pay our salaries as long as we were in the program. And so the component you went to, I went to TSA, Transportation Security Administration. While I was there under the program, they kind of got free labor, but I was treated as an intern, a junior person in the office, and I was getting experience while I was taking my training. And there was I was maybe not guaranteed a placement at TSA, but I was guaranteed a placement somewhere within the department. So imagine if the people who were working that problem got together with like Karen's group and were like, hey, like you're excelling in this part where you're actually attracting the talent a lot better maybe, or, whatever. You're creating the pipeline. Tell us more about that. And then DHS shares their lessons learned on like how they were able to have a smoother path to placement, which is an area I hear Karen is struggling with in DCTC. So it could be government-wide if we really wanted to. It's just really hard because no one owns that single problem. And it's up to individuals who might care about that problem, like Karen and John, to think about it and be like, how do we do this? Like, who do I have to talk to at this organization? Or who do I have to bug to do cross-agency collaboration? Because no one's really incentivized or prioritizes that type of thinking because we just have our jobs that we're told to do.
All right, so these are all great points, and I'm happy to hear that a lot of this is exportable because that, I think, is my, we have one half the government that works one way and one that works another, and I would hope that it can all be functional. But I think as we're nearing an hour, and we could probably talk about this forever, and I look forward to more writing on this because I feel like it's an under-addressed issue. I am hopeful because the RFO does have a component, and folks like Bonnie, and I know there are others, Polly Hall, Eric Cho, among others, they're all working as a team on the workforce piece of this. So that gives me hope that this has been baked into some of this reform effort. But I guess bringing back to kind of why we're here, in the near term, at a time where there is a lot of rapid change happening and a lot of uncertainty, what would you argue is like the next thing? If you had a wish list, and I think that's a terrible thing because it's so comprehensive and it's so complicated and there's so many different pieces, but if you had a wish list of like, what would be something small, even some next step we could take to kind of move this forward, what would that look like? You know, what's a concrete step? Because one of the things, I think you're right, Bonnie, I did mention in the piece that I co-authored with Steve Schooner, we talked about you need like an institutional champion. We need somebody really to focus on these issues. And I'm talking to 3 of them right now. And so what would you do if tomorrow somebody said, give me one thing I can do today to start moving the ball forward on this? And I don't know if we want to, okay, John, there you go. John, you go first.
Yeah, sorry, I'm quick to jump on this usually. So I think pulling a couple things together, right? So this depends on 2 things. One is it's dependent on leaders who, if they were asked the question, like, hey, what happens if you invest in your workforce and they leave? They reply, well, what happens if we don't and they stay? So it does require leaders that are saying, I'm willing to make an investment, whether I personally get a direct return or the government does in general, right? And so, yeah, it's dependent on leaders that have that vision to be able to do that and then have the resources, right? So it would be great if someone set aside resources and said, you're going to invest this much in your workforce. Just take that argument off the top. Identify the resources, take that argument off the top and make the resources available. And then the second part is a lot of what we've been talking about is, okay, now that I got the resources, what's the program look like? How do we invest in them? We've got one blueprint that we think makes a lot of sense in our space. There's others as well. But those 2 parts, if I had to change anything, is just make an investment decision up front. Say, we got to invest in the workforce. We got to invest in the workforce that we need, right? We're going to change the workforce. No one's arguing that change isn't necessary. Change is needed, right? So that's the good news. It's not like we've got a whole bunch of people saying, nope, everything's working perfectly, don't change. Everyone recognizes, no, there's change needed, and that the workforce is a component of it. Set an investment aside and then make an investment, realizing, and then don't hold people to say, well, if you invested this much in developing person, you've got to guarantee the return for you specifically. They may not get it. It may be the person next to them. It may be where the person goes eventually. But recognize that's what's needed.
Karen.
I think what goes along with that is that I want us to talk about this. I want us to talk about people, and I want us to talk about people as bundles of skills. And I want us to be able to articulate what those skills are. I want us to know about it in ourselves. I want us each to know what we're good at, what we bring to a team, and how we work with that team. And I want those things to be, as John said, invested in, which means you're going to have to be able to measure them, right? Because John's point about measuring and managing and anything that's going to have a dollar figure, even if you accept that the impact is going to be long range, you want to be able to say, like I used to when I would come back to the office in the morning after going to class at night, like I learned to think differently about this at class last night because I listened to my classmate who works at an industry partner, and I've only been thinking about this the way I've learned in this government agency. So I think we have to not just talk about empowering, but to be able to define and recognize what the skills are that we want our workforce to demonstrate, and then give them time to practice them, give them feedback on how they're doing, stretch them, but in so doing, show that we care about their development.
Yeah, so I think that's a perfect foundation to kind of lay my practitioner view of the world on this, because it builds upon what John and Karen just talked about, where in order to have the space to practice, and this is the spirit of what John was talking about, of putting experimentation at the forefront, learning, unlearning, all of these things, it cannot happen unless you can remove fear from your environment. So I don't care what level you're at. I don't care if you're the head of the agency or you're just the doer, like action officer, practitioner. You have to be accountable for your part of it. You can't control everything, but how can you exemplify and embody what it means to do all the things Karen's talking about? So that might mean, like, as an example, John just said everyone is acknowledging. You're hearing this from every angle, top down, left and right. What we've been doing is not working. So how can I or you do something different? And you don't have to revolutionize overnight. Like, pick something small. Maybe, for example, stop asking for slides and see what happens. I'm not saying that I'm not wedded to the tactic. I never am, but that's just a classic one you're going to hear across government. But just do it and see what happens. Do you have better communication or ineffective communication? Or do you get better outcomes or not better outcomes? Maybe I, as wherever I am organizationally, like, look at what's been happening process-wise or workflow-wise, pick one small thing that's not going to break everything and just say, we're not going to do that, and just see what happens. Because that's experimentation. You don't know what's going to happen. You have theories on what's going to happen, but you actually need to see what happens. Otherwise, we're all assuming hypotheticals are going to, like, and this goes to your protest comment, right? Like, everyone's assuming protest, like, it will lead to protest, and you really don't know. And at the end of the day, maybe you should be okay with that. Maybe you should be okay that it gets protested, because maybe it needs to be, whatever you're pushing the edge on does need a platform, and other practitioners need to know this is okay. So that's my long-winded way of saying, push boundaries and figure out what that means in your span of control. So if you're at the bottom of the organization, middle, or top of the organization, that's going to look differently. But pick one thing. That's my challenge to everybody. And just don't do it, or do something different and see for a week or 30 days and just see what happens. And that is planting the seeds to, I think, changing culture and getting to the places that we've been talking about for the last hour.
I love those things, and when I train, and I do it like through Defense Acquisition University and others, I always use the characters from Inside Out.
Yes.
For like what I call the pathologies that actually inhibit one of the things you recommended. I also think that that's fascinating, the idea of maybe it needs to be protested, when I think of like highest technically rated at a fair and reasonable price, the new kind of category of evaluation under FAR 15. That was tested, and we actually were teaching that protests itself before. Now it's RFO, which is fascinating, and I love that. Although I don't think a lot of people, lawyers in the government, share your enthusiasm for let's just see if it gets protested. That's a different podcast. I just wanted to say thank you. I think we could probably talk about this for another 3 hours, but this was really, I think it's inspiring, and for an issue that to me has been so absent from the conversation. I'm talking to 3 people who've given it a lot of thought, and it's really clear that there are solutions, and some of them are attainable in the near term. But hopefully we can have more like this, and this is just the first of many. And hopefully I'm talking to you guys in the next 6 to 12 months, maybe 6 months, and see where we are with some of the initiatives you're working on. But again, thank you. Thank you for coming and joining us, and I hope we see some of these things implemented. All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the FAR. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future conversations at the intersection of law, policy, and practice.